Bonjour, Kinamagi and Nene Ireland Indigenous, and welcome to this production of Social Studies Explorer. Today's episode, Chapter 4, Lesson 10, Fighting Back. We've read a little bit already about how slavery was, well, there is no good way to say very bad to truly grasp how really bad slavery is. Many shiploads of humans from West Africa, from the Caribbean, had made their way to what is now the United States. People were forced to adopt a new religion, had their families sold out from beside them, were beaten, were worked to the point of exhaustion. And as you might guess, it's not really all that fun. People get mad. So as time went on, many of the slaves fought back against the unfair and inhumane treatment. As you read, consider why the slaves would try to fight back when the cost was so high. Peaceful protest. Enslaved people found a lot of ways to resist their enslavement. For example, they would do the work they were asked to do, but they would take a long time doing it. If they were asked to work in a field, they might accidentally break the tool they were supposed to be using. Once it was broken, they would have to have it fixed and would therefore have to take some time out of the workday. Others would pretend to be sick to avoid work. Things like this worked on occasion, but slave owners were aware of the things that were happening. If they started to sense that a slave was trying to trick them out of doing work, they would get very angry. Since slaves didn't have a lot of rights, slave owners could punish them in any way they saw fit. They would have their overseer keep a close eye on the slaves to make sure no trickery was happening on their plantation. If an overseer thought a slave was acting up, they often had the permission to deal with the situation in any way they chose. Slaves were whipped, beaten, and hurt physically and mentally in many ways. Essentially, anything up to, but not including, murdering the slave was allowable. And the only reason that they might not want to murder a slave is because then the slave can no longer do work for them. Running away. One common form of escaping slavery was to run away. Slaves used their dark complexion to their advantage and tried to escape at night. They used the thick forests of the South and their knowledge of natural navigation, like following stars, to help them find the way north. They were helped along the way by other colonists as well as free African men and women. These helpers gave runaways money or helped them hide out. This type of support system was later called the Underground Railroad. It was not underground, and it was not a train or railway. We'll talk more about the Underground Railroad this week. The slave owners did not like it when slaves ran away. Oh, boo-hoo. To lose a slave meant to lose a lot of money. So the slave owners worked really hard to keep this from happening. They would often send out search crews to bring back runaways, post reward notes, or search for missing slaves themselves. If runaway slaves were found and captured, they were often punished severely. When they returned, they would be given more difficult work, put in chains, whipped, or they could be sold to another plantation away from their friends and family. Slaves knew this was a risk when they chose to run away. They would send these fugitive slave hunters as far away as, say, from Kentucky to Michigan. And fugitive slave hunters would travel along the north looking for escaped slaves. And you can see on here there's a advertisement for a reward from August of 1774 in New York, that a man named Will, about 27 years of age, 5'6", very talkative. Either way, he took off. Good for him. But now they had to find a way to avoid people who read the newspaper. It's $10 was a lot of money in those days. This wasn't just a lunch at McDonald's, considering how little people earned. It was a lot. Buying freedom. Sometimes a slave was allowed to buy back their freedom. Remember, the slave owners paid a lot of money to own these people. The slaves also earned them a lot of money. So slave owners were not very likely to allow this to happen. However, on occasion, a slave was given this chance. The owners did not make it easy on slaves trying to buy their freedom, though. Slaves did not make any personal money for their weekly work, so they would have to do extra chores to earn money. They were often underpaid for their efforts, but some very determined slaves were able to succeed at this. This is particularly true when you get to places in the North. One slave famous for doing this was Venture Smith. Venture came to the colonies at the age of 6. He had been captured from his home in Africa and was brought to the colonies to be sold as a slave. He spent the next 30 years working as a slave in New England. In 1765, at the age of 36, Venture was able to buy his freedom. After he was free, he worked nonstop to buy the freedom of his wife and children. Eventually, he also paid for the freedom of several other African slaves. Rebellion. Often enough, slaves felt like they had no other way out of slavery except to fight their way out. One example of this is Stono's Rebellion. This event happened on September 9th, 1739. On that day, 20 black slaves met at a secret location near the Stono River in South Carolina. They planned to find a way to escape to freedom. Shortly after the meeting, they broke into a local store, stole guns and powder, and killed the 2 workers there. 20 men started to march, and as they marched, other slaves joined them. This led to one of the largest slave uprisings in the colonies, though many more occurred after the Revolutionary War. By the time the slave owners caught up with these slaves, they confronted 60 to 100 angry men. Approximately 20 white colonists and about 40 slaves were killed in the battle. As a result, South Carolina's lawmakers created an even more restrictive slave code. The new codes limited the privileges of all slaves. They could no longer grow their own food. They were not allowed to meet in groups, earn money, or learn to read. Some of these codes had already existed, but after the Stono Rebellion, Southern leaders strictly enforced these laws. Stono's Rebellion was not the only case of this kind of reaction to slavery. In fact, there were about 250 documented rebellions throughout the colonies. Some other good examples of this type of reaction are Vesey's Rebellion in 1822 and Nat Turner's Rebellion in 1831. Some possible activities you might choose to do: research another rebellion of slaves that happened in the colonies and write a news article or blog about what happened, who was involved, when it happened, and the results of the rebellion. Or research the lives of another slave who purchased his or her own freedom and write a short story about the life and that person lived and how freedom was gained. I will allow for both of these to be options when we get to the assignment. They're encouraged, but not quite required, just due to time constraints. I think it'd be very interesting to learn more about the rebellion. Like for me, I've enjoyed reading about Nat Turner. That's one of the more famous slave rebellions. We keep in mind that slave rebellions are never peaceful. And that's inherently the truth because they have to literally fight their way out of it. So if you don't like stories of violence, might not be the activity or the lesson for you. At this point, you should return to the Google Classroom to check out any further attached readings or assignments that are posted there. If you have any questions, please reach out to me at mireland@sagchipschool.net. Otherwise, have a minogijagad, minwa, pamapi.